por estar acompañando. Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches a todas y a todos que nos acompañan en esta sesión. Hoy tenemos el privilegio de contar y la fortuna de contar con uno de los grandes académicos que están trabajando sobre la diplomacia pública, la diplomacia eh, cultural, la diplomacia pública digital de China, y es el profesor Zhao Alexander Huang. Y hoy vamos a charlar con él, vamos a darle la bienvenida y me voy a permitir hacer la presentación, primero en español y después la presentación en inglés, porque vamos a hacer este cambio, como lo hemos estado haciendo, este cambio idiomático de inglés a español y viceversa, en un modo más relajado, que pues ese es el objetivo de esta serie de diálogos, conocer a estos grandes expertos sobre China. Me voy a permitir primero introducir, presentar al profesor Zhao. El doctor Zhao Alexander Huang es profesor asociado de Ciencias de la Comunicación en la Universidad Gustave Eiffel, en Francia. Trabaja en el laboratorio DICEN IDF y es investigador asociado del Centro de Internet y Sociedad del Centro Nacional Francés de Investigación Científica. Como experto en diplomacia pública digital, fue seleccionado conjuntamente por el Centro de Diplomacia Pública de la USC y la Fundación Internacional de Singapur como becario de investigación del sudeste asiático en el año 2023. Su estudio se centró en las prácticas institucionales, las estrategias de comunicación política y la formación de narrativas estratégicas en la diplomacia pública, específicamente para abordar el caso de China. También le voy a permitir hacer un breve bosquejo de algunos de los textos que ha trabajado el profesor Zhao, precisamente para ubicar algunos de sus papers más emblemáticos y que han tenido mayor impacto en la literatura especializada. Entre ellos tenemos este texto publicado en el Journal, Asian Journal of Communication, y el título es Expand Engagement in China's Digital Public Diplomacy. Es uno de los textos más leídos del profesor Zhao. Otro texto importante es Exploring China's Digitalization of Public Diplomacy on Weibo and Twitter, a case of a study of the US-China trade war. Por supuesto, nosotros, aquellos especialistas en la diplomacia pública, también la diplomacia cultural desde esta perspectiva digital, bueno, este es uno de los artículos que definitivamente nos interesan a todos. Uno de los proyectos también en los que ha trabajado el profesor Zhao es precisamente sobre la diplomacia digital concerniente al análisis de toda la dinámica que sucede en el Mar del Sur de China y se titula China versus Asian: Digital Diplomacy Involving the South China Sea. Y este pues es un proyecto que trabaja de la mano con sus pares en la Universidad USC. So, Professor Zhao, thank you so much for being with us. We are so glad to have you here, and we appreciate your time to talk with the Mexican students and the Mexican community at the Mexican International Studies Association.
Thank you, Priscila, for this invitation and to making me on board. It's really nice to meet all of you guys. I'm so sorry, my poor Espanol. I don't really speak really good Espanol, so I'm not going to, okay, just one sentence maybe. Buenos días a todos.
Muy
Okay.
buenos días. Okay, Zhao, it would be very nice to start talking about yourself. How would you become a so well-known Chinese scholar studying digital diplomacy? Can you talk a little bit about yourself and your work?
Thank you for this question. I'm not saying I'm really well-established scholar. I also position myself just like an emerging scholar because always we are so young in terms of the studies, and we also learning something from others. So I position myself as a always emerging scholar and young scholar because I want to learn more ideas about this kind of thing. Starting my career as an academic is not a coincidence because before getting in my academic career, I was a journalist at China National Radio. So at that time, I did a lot of works with Chinese government, as well as at that time I exercised as a intercultural journalist as well. So at that time, I worked closely with French embassy in China for a lot of international communication project at the beginning of 2010s. So thanks to this kind of experience, I learned from the field what is about cultural diplomacy, what is about public diplomacy. So I was really attracted by French cultural diplomacy because of my, professional links. I have a lot of friends from France in China when I was journalist, and thanks to this opportunity, I started learning French. So that's why I decided to move to France to start my academic career until now. So learning about China's public diplomacy, this is also one of my big concerns when I was journalist, because at that time we have a lot of reports on how China used Confucius Institute to influence people's thinking, how effective this kind of, Confucius Institute's implementation overall in the world. So I was really curious about this kind of topic. That's why when I started my PhD, I learned how Confucius Institute worked for China's public diplomacy, especially in African countries. So I did my research in Kenya, especially to learn how this very first Confucius Institute of China, established in Africa, uh, circulate or deploy China's soft power through different activities. And during that time, I also mentioned there's a trend of Chinese government to use to establish some communication activities through Twitter at the very beginning of 2010s. So I was curious about that, how China could do that. So I start my first investigation on China's presence on Twitter in 2017 and 18, this kind of time, to focus how Chinese diplomats and Chinese media, national state-sponsored media, to do this kind of online influence to tell China stories as well. That's why I wrote the very first article published by International Journal of Communication entitled "Building a Network to Tell China Stories." It's just an exploratory studies to understand how China use or how China deal with Twitter. Because it's really interesting, because if you know, at the beginning of the digital age, all of scholars try to understand social media just like a democratization platform which can boost the freedom of speech, something like that. But as you know, you have a controversial situation for China, because China is a authoritarian system and country. They have a series censorship and a series propagandist rules. But how this kind of regime can use Twitter to do public diplomacy? This is my basic question of research to do this kind of thing. And finally, we find how China use this kind of platform to continue its international propaganda strategy and exercises as well. So here we are until today. I think I got really good opportunity, because at the beginning we don't have a lot of scholars focusing on China's digital diplomacy. So I was luckily one of them. So I got some publications, and I got some quotations, and I got some, recognitions from our peers, colleagues as well. Yeah.
Now, it's quite interesting that you mentioned how the study of Confucius Institute was a pillar for your productive work. In Mexico, we also have Confucius Institute, and we also have Twitter, and we have like the contact with this digital Chinese diplomacy. Can you talk a little bit about your findings in this Confucian Institute research? How was in Kenya?
Yeah, for me, in my research about Confucius Institute, I think basically they have the three level strategies. I use the term macro, meso, and micro to conceptualize that. At the macro level, Confucius Institute has been guided by a series of institutional discourses or institutional rules. That means fundamentally, China used the laws, the political orders, and some institutional tests to institutionalize the existence of Confucius Institute inside of China. That means Confucius Institute is established by the Minister of Education of China, but it placed also as a as co-hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in somewhat. And when China tried to establish Confucius Institute in Africa, I'm not talking about Latin America, in Africa, don't you should remember China and Africa has a huge collaboration network named FOCAC, Forum on China Africa Corporations. China continue to use the same strategy with this kind of, bilateral network or association or this kind of, convention to institutionalize the existence of Confucius Institute as as a way that China try to help Africa to do this kind of international, all of Chinese training, Chinese language teaching, and Chinese technology teaching as well. So they use the first level, this huge macro level, by using the foreign policy, the institutional tests, and bilateral conventions to frame the existence, to establish the legitimacy of the building of Confucius Institute on the ground of Africa. Second level, what we call Confucius Institute is a meso-level network coordinations. That means what? That means if you know Confucius Institute maybe it has been established at your university, but behind this kind of establishment, you have another Chinese university in collaboration with the local host universities. But this is not the end of this kind of network coordination. It's the very beginning. Because through the network of this kind of what we call, co-company, logics, Chinese side can mobilize a lot of their own networks. For example, China's embassy in the local country, in the host country, or Chinese companies in the host countries to create a lot of events or create a lot of offers for their own Confucius Institute students. So this is what I call the meso level of organizational coordination and organizational networks. It enable local Confucius Institute have a lot of opportunities for their students. Because of that, a lot of local students will see the interest to learn Chinese. And then we move to the third level, micro level of Confucius Institute. That means in the daily life of Confucius Institute, the students are mobilized by the teachers through narratives, through daily narratives, through the daily storytelling techniques to show how China has been advanced in terms of technology, economy, society. I can give you an example of my field work. For example, in Nairobi, a really common story I heard when I did my field work is a lot of teachers try to show students how fascinating China's, metro system is, how advancing China's economy is. They show a lot of photos of China's, the big cities, the big cities pictures, the huge building pictures, the advancement technology big pictures or videos, and then they add some stories. Do you know 40 years ago or 50 years ago, before Chinese reform, we are just like you. We don't have really strong infrastructure. We don't have well developed infrastructure. But because of Deng Xiaoping's reform in 1978, we changed our mind, we open our economy, we open our country, we get a lot of investment, and we work so hard to build our countries. And today, we are here. We are your friends, my dear friends. We are here to help you, to teach you how to build your country. And China never had, uh, you know, uh, what we what they call imperialist story histories. We're always the victim of the colonialism. So we know we are here is to help you. We help you building your highway. We help you to build the railway and railway stations, and we teach you how to drive the train, how to build the railway, and then we'll go back home. We are going back home, so it's yours. So this is our historical friendship and brotherhood. They always use this kind of engagement to convince people, to show people how China do something for the country's benefactors as well. And also, don't forget, Chinese in Confucius Institute can grant a lot of scholarship for students. They can give the young students a long-term grant. Basically, they can use this grant to study in China for 10 years. That means from the bachelor to the PhD. And then the student can go back home and they can become an ambassador for Chinese culture and Chinese policy. Behind that, they can also create an alumnium network and club to engage to target, the political elites or future elites of the country. And we use this kind of gift and counter gift mechanism in anthropology. Finally, people will have some really good perception and engagement for helping China out in the host country. So this is about what Confucius Institute can do in the local development and in its in the China's public diplomacy influence.
Great. So you are mentioning this analytical category, China's story, and China's story related to Confucius Institute and how we can use the self-power concept to analyze this phenomena. And I want to ask you, what are your thoughts about using this self-power concept, a Western concept, to analyze this Chinese cultural diplomacy experience?
The first one, I want to say I'm so sorry to learn the pass away of Joseph Nye, the soft power founder. And secondly, I was thinking, since several years, I try to figure out what happened for soft power because, yeah, soft power is a nice framework for us to understand a lot of international relations and public diplomacy practice, of course. And soft power gave us umbrella concept that enable us to do a lot of analytical framework and analytical works. But for China's case, I'm not saying this is a soft power. Even for Joseph Nye, he said it's more like, sharp power, because this is not democratic country who mobilize the soft power components. So in this case, behind that, this kind of soft power deployment, you have an authoritarian system who legitimize everything through censorship and propaganda. So this is not what we learned of soft power. For Chinese scholar, the Chinese government and Chinese scholar try to avoid this kind of soft power debate by localize the term of soft power. That means they try to conceptualize soft power just like a practice of soft use of national powers. That is wonderful. Because of this kind of reconceptualization, Chinese scholar can put all what we classified hard power component, for example, economy, in China's soft power toolbox. The most evident example is One Belt and One Road initiative, Belt and Road initiatives. That means China considered all these kind of infrastructure buildings or economic aid like a sort of China's soft power. But you know, behind that, maybe you will be triggered by Chinese government, because in general, this kind of credit offered by Chinese government, behind that you have a lot of obligation to refund the investment or refund the loan as well. If you cannot do that, maybe China can blackmail something. For example, look at what happened in Djibouti. Djibouti is a African country would face a lot of diet problems. So in this case, the country needs to rent the port, the military port to Chinese military for 99 years. So, behind the soft power, what we call sharp power of China, of economy, you have a lot of maybe tricks.
Okay, yeah, this is sharp power concept is also another Western concept that actually comes from the US. So it's quite interesting to know how also the Chinese intellectuals are pushing its own concepts to analyze Chinese experience.
Yeah,
Well, let's move on a little bit. You also have been working on panda engagement.
yeah,
In this article, you demonstrate how Chinese state media uses constructive journalism to foster emotional resonance.
yeah,
In this case, about pandas and how this serves as a vessel for softening China's global image overall. Oh,
yeah.
so in terms of perception, this is quite interesting. Can you talk a little bit about how perceptions are related to cultural diplomacy and especially in digital diplomacy?
Okay. So I always use a really serious term to conceptualize panda diplomacy, because this is just like seemingly like a surprisingly soft or even a typical practice of China's public diplomacy, but it's purely political, if you want. At the first glance, for example, leading pandas to foreign countries or foreign countries' zoos may look like a charming gesture for goodwill for the global collaboration of scientific, etc., or also a gesture of cute of China. But when we take a close look on this kind of policy, it actually reveals a lot about the deeper logic of China's public diplomacy. So, for example, in my research, I have explored how panel diplomacy isn't just about conservation or cultural exchange. It's a form of uh, diplomacy or digital form based on narratives and emotions, alongside more overt and digital forms of international communication. That means China tried to use a symbol or the image of panda to show some cuteness, to show some interesting image of panda in order to englobe some narratives. Because panda are cuteness, panda are clemency, panda are really nice. So when people watch the panda's image, they are not feel like in danger. So Chinese government try to project this kind of image, integrating some narratives related to China's peaceful rise. In this case, when people saw the panda's image, they will have the imagination, just like, okay, panda is not dangerous. So China has, panda is the national treasure of China. So China maybe is not dangerous, it's peaceful. So in this case, we can apply, um, the similarity of peers' ideas. That means firstness, secondness, and thirdness to understand this kind of thing. If we analyze briefly, simply for this kind of theory, the firstness means some quality. That means the existence of some post. Okay, working on X. If we just look at the X on the image of panda, it's just a panda post. It's a post, and when we read that thing, we come to the secondness. That means we try to understand the situation. We try to have some, incitation of the emotion or some feelings. So when we have this kind of thing, we learn the message. We saw the panda's clemency. We saw there's some test, and then we read something. When you read something, you're enter in a cognitive level of engagement. That means you try to learn and understand something. The act of understanding is not only about input, it's also about interpretation. So when you interpret something in your head, you need to link a lot of existing knowledges. When you saw the panda, oh, cut, cute, clemency. And we saw the message made by China. China want to promote the, international peace. And we are a country love peace and love this kind of thing. Our development always follow this kind of peaceful rise initiatives. So you will link clemency and peaceful rise, and in a long-term influence process, maybe it can correct people's thinking of China. Oh, look at panda is so cute. So China is nice. We can go to China to discover something. So you have this kind of logic here to do this kind of influence. So that's the same thing when we create the different digital memes. How can we use some really cute cat memes to influence people's thinking, to create that kind of a sort of, cultural, pop cultural ideas to conceptualize panda's image. Yeah. So this is always the same strategy for China to expand China's discursive power through different imagery and emotion.
Great. Talking a little bit about how another narrative is very popular, specifically in Mexican-China's relations. This is like the ancient civilization narrative. So you already told us about this panda diplomacy, but what is your analysis about this ancient civilization narrative in terms of this emotional engagement in China's public diplomacy? What is the image that they want to project?
I think in this kind of ancient civilization, it's about the culture. So, but I'm not culturalist, so I'm not doing cultural studies. But what I understood of this kind of elements of culture are correct culture. That means what? That means China tried to use the different elements of culture, of its ancient culture, to build an environment or an environment of communication to show the stereotypes or to project some cliches with ancient China. That means Chinese people always have custom tongue. It's an ancient custom, and they have always Chinese food. This kind of food can trace back to, almost 2,000 years ago. In this kind of meditation process, they try to mobilize some basic cultural events or basic cultural elements or correct cultural element to conduct Chinese narratives. We are a country have a long history of peaceful rise. We are a country have a long history is a long history of the glory. So this is Chinese people who want to fight, to build, to establish this kind of Asian glory history, what we call Chinese dream. So in this case, they try to rationalize all Chinese policy by using this kind of elements. But maybe this is not a real Chinese ancient culture and civilization because they are not talking about, uh, Confucius. They're not talking about Mencius. They're not talking about the really, really ancient classic text or ideas. They just use some really symbolic elements to project what they want to show Chinese culture.
Okay, good. And now let's move on to one of your articles, like exploring China's digitalization of public diplomacy on Weibo and Twitter, a case of study of the US-China trade war. In Mexico, we are pretty familiar with the US punitive tariff policy and all this narrative as a strong instrument in foreign policy. What are your main argument in this article?
Oh, in this article, our main argument is about the intermastic move. Intermastic is a term that means international and domestic. That means how China use the social media to do an intermastic policy making process and a policy legitimation process. If you want, in China, because of the social media restrictions, because of the digital governance, Chinese internautes are or netizens are not do not have right to access all international social media platforms, even for internet websites, for example, Google, Facebook, Twitter, they don't have any accesses. But in China, they have their own social media or internet system, ecosystem as well. They have the similar research motor, just like Baidu instead of Google. You have Weibo instead of X. So in this case, China has their own online communication systems to use to do the public diplomacy practice. So in these studies, we try to compare the same actors, that means the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, how they use the both domestic social media platform and international social media platform like Twitter to circulate, to build its foreign policy purposes. The really interesting point we found is Chinese government try to follow up a central kitchen narrative production process. That means all all their political purpose have been first announced and diffused on the domestic platform on Weibo, and because of Weibo's function just like a propaganda platform. Chinese MFA people do not care about the reformulations or the style of narratives, etc. They just put on a huge communique of price. But on Twitter, Chinese diplomats try to fragment all the narratives. They try to build a different styles of narratives. They try to use humors. They try to use their narrative. They try to use some personal narratives as well to create a polyphonic illusions. What is polyphonic illusions? That means maybe you when you watch one post made by a diplomat, it's just like a humor-oriented narratives. Maybe you watch something, it's just like a personal narratives about the fact. But if you link everything together made by Chinese diplomats and there's media or there's diplomatic missions, you will understand they have the same page. They are on the same page. They have the right line of propaganda. They have a right line of policy deployment. That means they are not going to cross this kind of right line. They always respect this kind of thing. But because of social media affordance, this kind of fragmented messages can build a huge influence networks, narrative networks, which can orient people thinking about the China's understanding or China's understanding of about the policy of the world view as well, in order to defend China's main ideas and discourse and statement during the trade war time.
Great. So you describe China's diplomacy, digital diplomacy strategy as a timid polyphony.
Yeah.
Incorporating multiple voices without crossing censorship lines. Can you elaborate on how this form of polyphony might evolve as Chinese media and diplomatic actors engage with global publics? Is there a potential for a genuine dialogue, or this is inherently a one-side communication model?
It's a really interesting point because for Chinese government at very beginning time of this digital public diplomacy, the main purpose is not to target international audiences. It's to target domestic audiences, to seek a strong nationalism. So in this case, they don't care about the dialogue. They do a lot of efforts just to uniformize their own voice, what we call monologue. Chinese diplomats they try to use a really propaganda oriented strategy or similar like just domestic propaganda strategy. That means they use Twitter to create a lot of diplomatic accounts during this time. They want to organize they want to create some networked dynamics among these Chinese counterparts. If you want, for my first studies, when we watch this kind of Chinese digital diplomacy practice, we only target and we only found 20-ish Twitter accounts. And at that time, when they try to communicate among themselves or to communicate China's foreign policies, they try to intentionally mention their foreign counterpart to seek some mutual endorsement. But during the trade war, the very first trade war in 2018, we found the first thing is Chinese diplomats' accounts have been boosted from 20-ish to 80. Suddenly, they create a lot of social media accounts, and then they try to talk about their own viewpoints through different rhetoric and through different narratives and through different ways. And they stopped to do this kind of mentioning activities with their foreign counterpart, but instead they try to do a lot of mention with their own colleagues in different countries. In this case, they build a network of narratives on for for Chinese diplomats. So they try to use this kind of what we call internal propaganda logic to do the international communication strategy. Because basically they don't want to have the different voices. They want to unify their voices in order uh, to enhance the diffusion of their statements.
Okay, so this is a very interesting topic. We are so glad to hear all your questions, answers, and whatever. And now we are going to start the Q&A session. Por el momento vamos a empezar con nuestra sesión de preguntas y respuestas. So we invite all the audience on Facebook to write their questions so we can make them to Professor Zhao. And we also here in the Zoom meeting, we have some audience, and we are also inviting you to ask any of your questions to Professor. So we are going to start with some questions made by the students of international relations in Mexico, okay? Here we have one of them. Cynthia Paola Bolaños Ortiz says, thank you, Dr. Zhao, for sharing your knowledge. My question is, what are the short and long-term goals of the goals of the Chinese government's digital public diplomacy?
Okay, short-term goals, it's really different to target because now if you want, we are in a geopolitical tension period and everything goes so fast. So for Chinese government, they have the different goals now. So in general, they want to seek to build an international discourse which can favorite China's international presence and globalization. I can give you some really concrete example. If you want to compare the first Trump term and the second Trump term, how China tried to do this kind of digital diplomacy, you will understand China has did some really updated strategy related to the first Trump term during the trade war. For example, during the Trump first term, we saw Chinese diplomats really lean into what often called the wolf warrior diplomacy. That means public diplomacy style, very confrontal, very aggressive styles in terms of narratives. This approach worked well inside in China because at that time, China need to grab the domestic support, especially to continue to accumulate a nationalist emotions to support China to do this kind of thing. But internationally, as you all know, in Western countries, even in some global South countries, China's wolf warrior diplomacy actually backfired and hurt China's image and global reputation. Now, when Trump launched the second tariff war this year, Beijing public diplomacy response was really surprisingly more mature or strategic compared to earlier times. For example, on the one hand, as you have already read in the newspaper, China did match the US tariffs tit for tat. But on the other hand, China also used a more sophisticated narratives now online. Instead of surrounding combative, China framed itself as defending multilateralism and global economic stability. It tried to show the world that it was acting like a responsible global power, not a troublemaker, in comparing Trump's actions. And after for a while, it really looked like China had taken the narrative lead, and suddenly we have impression that Beijing was talking about the open market, globalization, and cooperation, using softer and more liberal surrounding languages as well. So it emphasized also some third-party support and try to make the conflict seems like seems less like a personal fight with Trump, but more like for a global interest. So if you want to see today's action, I would say, okay, the short-term goals of China's digital diplomacy is really want to show China as a responsible power, who try to defend the globalization and global trading as well. So this is really interesting because if you want to analyze this thing, you need to understand the big picture of the global conflict. But if you look at this kind of public diplomacy made by China 4 or 5 months ago, it's about the war. We are talking about the Russia and Ukraine war. But today, it's not the same thing. But if you look at the long-term strategy of this kind of China's digital diplomacy, basically they want to fight for the right to define a new world order that's in favor of China's geopolitical needs.
Thank you, Professor Zhao. Abril Cabrera is asking you, well, she says, good morning, Dr. Zhao. What has made China's panda diplomacy so successful? Here in Mexico, we have such unique animals like the ajolote or the monarch butterfly, but Mexico hasn't been able to use them as a tool of soft power or diplomacy.
This is a really good question. I think this is, this is not really new for China. Instead to say how China made panda diplomacy successful, I would like to say because of panda, China has done a good public diplomacy initiatives. Because animal diplomacy is not depends on the country who projects the animal. It depends on the animal itself. That means it depends on its geographical, situation. It depends on its rarity. It depends also on its viral recognition. So you have 3 key points for animal diplomacy. In this case, you can think about panda, you can think about koala in Australia. You can also think about any other animals. How can we use this kind of, its physical characteristics to mediatize some messages? And panda diplomacy is really interesting because China uses kind of diplomatic initiatives since 1950s until now. But what made it successful online because China tried to integrate this kind of panda diplomacy into the pop culture created or generated by social media platforms. That means China has invested a panda channel named iPanda channel at the domestic level. They put a lot of camera in China's panda conservation in order to allow online audiences to check on panda 24 hours per day. That means it's on live, so people can watch that. And because of the internet, the netizen, they try to capture the panda's image or panda's video and transform them just like a GIF or digital meme and to circulate this kind of just like the virus to circulate online. And then they can create and seek some successful emotional feedback about people's online about panda. But I would like to say panda diplomacy is not really successful during for example during the pandemic time or during some geopolitical tension period, because people will see other activities of China which could destroy this kind of good perceptions or good reputation made by panda. Yeah.
Thank you. Diego Ramirez says, it's a pleasure to have you, Dr. Zhao. My question is, What are the challenges that China has faced, and what has it done to establish its digital public diplomacy as it is nowadays?
Oh, interesting question. Let's talk about the recent news. When Trump moved into his second round, we also started to find something else about China's public diplomacy. As I have mentioned just now, China has a more mature aspect of digital diplomacy, and the trade war was creating also a kind of international divide between global North and global South. We all mentioned this kind of series. So as China saw an opportunity, but China saw an opportunity in its diplomatic practice. For example, in digital public diplomacy, China began to target audiences in Africa, in Latin America, and South Asia. They tried framing the trade war as an example of US economic creations. So rather than just defending itself, China started to acting like a spokesperson for developing countries and for fighting for all benefactors of the global economy. For example, recently, if you read the news, you will mention that the President Xi Jinping has visited in South Asia, especially in Vietnam, and back in April. He called for more cooperation with China to safeguard free trade and build a stable, open international environment. And China diplomats also pushed this message online in order to show China as a protector of global order, while projecting the United States as a rude, selfish, and untrustful, bully Uncle Sam. So in Africa, China also played up its historical solidarity with developing nations and used the narrative to strengthen trade and financial ties. And in Latin America, I think you also feel that it's been actively pushing for new free trade agreement as a way to compete with US influence. China has done a lot of media campaign to show, okay, we need to build a strong link between China and Latin America, maybe with Mexico, maybe with Brazil, in the framework of Belt and Road initiatives as well. So in general, is this kind of initiative has been made by China, but despite of all efforts, there are some challenges. As you also maybe know, China's own domestic market is slowing. Trade restrictions from the West are tightening as well, and the tensions between China with the US keep escalating. So, while this digital diplomacy strategy is ambitious, we still don't know how effective it will be in a long-term operation, especially when China's economic attractivity is losing its way because of the domestic economic crisis. So this is a big challenge as well for China.
Professor Rosia Arroyo Belmonte says, thank you very much, Professor Zhao. It's very interesting. I would like to ask you, what is the relationship between Chinese cultural diplomacy and the cultural diplomacy of its neighbors, such as Korea and Japan?
I was thinking China's public cultural diplomacy is not really well developed since a long time ago. They try to use what they call cultural diplomacy, just like Confucius Institute, or you have also a special workshop named the Luban workshop. If Confucius Institute worked on cultural aspect in order to achieve a lot of cultural events in host countries, in order to teach Chinese overseas, in order to teach Chinese civilization overseas, then Luban workshop is focused more on how to teach foreign people, especially African people, technologies. So they have this kind of two aspects through what we call cultural diplomacy perspectives. But unlike Japan or Korea, which created a strong, pop cultural initiatives, China's pop culture initiatives was not as strong as their neighbor did because of the censorship, because of an ideological censorship, I suppose. Because my big concern and big hypothesis about why China doesn't has a strong, cultural diplomacy initiatives or strong pop cultural initiatives, it's because on the ideological censorship. A lot of themes have been strongly censored in China. For example, the LGBTQ issues. For example, the critical thinking. For example, a lot of challenging, the challenging ideas about the China's history during the war. You cannot be allowed to use or to mobilize in cultural productions. Yeah, of course, recently you have some really interesting Chinese films who which getting, some influence or emergence in the global, society. But it's still it's still a solo case about the cultural diplomacy.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhao, for have the time to be with us. We are very pleasure. And that's it. We are so happy. We hopefully see you in Mexico at some point in the annual Congress of the Mexican International Studies Association. Well,
Yes.
thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me and see you very soon.
See you. Muchísimas gracias a todas y a todos por participar en esta sesión. Es muy enriquecedora. Los invitamos a nuestra próxima sesión, que será en el mes de agosto, el último viernes del mes de agosto. Estaremos hablando con una experta en feminismos de China en el sur global. Los invitamos a todos. Nos vamos de vacaciones, así como ustedes. No tendremos sesión los próximos meses de junio y julio, pero ansiosamente los esperamos para que se unan a esta plataforma cuyo objetivo es dialogar sobre diferentes asuntos relacionados a las relaciones internacionales sobre China. Muchísimas gracias y también le extendemos los agradecimientos a todas las autoridades de la Asociación Mexicana de Estudios Internacionales por facilitar todas las condiciones para llevar a cabo esta serie de diálogos sobre China, en la que se nos une también la FES Acatlán de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México y el Departamento de Estudios Internacionales de la Universidad Iberoamericana. Muchísimas gracias a todas y a todos. Hasta la próxima.